Hello and welcome to Decoded, a WRI-India series that breaks down complex climate concepts with the help of experts. Today we have with us Ruchika Singh, Executive Director of the Food, Land and Water Program at WRI-India, to help us decode sustainable food systems. Hi Ruchika, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Aditi.
So to begin with, let's talk a little about what we mean by food systems and what comprises it.
Thanks for the question, Aditi. India is a diverse country and our food system is complex. When we talk about food systems in the Indian context, it's about providing access to healthy and nutritious diet to almost 1.4 billion people. Food systems are also central to livelihoods in India, with over 50% of our workforce in agriculture. A majority of them, 85%, are small and marginal landholders with less than 2 hectares of land. And almost 70% of the rural households in India depend on land for sustenance. We know India is facing the intense challenge of mitigating impacts of climate change while building strategies for adapting to these risks and feeding its population. As I said, the agriculture sector is dominated by smallholders facing intense challenge in adapting to climate change. Our agricultural land have poor soil health. Almost 50% of our agricultural soils are degraded. The strategies that enabled green revolution in India to meet the challenge of that time of feeding the hungry people led to also intensive production, for instance, and our associated policies have degraded our soils, led to excess water withdrawal, high chemical runoffs, etc. So we really need to think about food and land use systems through an integrated lens and think about not only the production systems, but also market distribution and consumption and the associated food supply chain. And when we think about all of this together, we are thinking about what sustainable food systems in India could look like.
So, now that we are at sustainable food systems, maybe you could talk a little more about what do we mean by sustainability in food systems and why we are at a stage where we need it, especially at this time.
We need sustainability in our food systems. As I said, to mitigate some of the climate impacts, we know that some of the IPCC reports have also talked about how South Asia and India is going to be impacted by it. We are seeing intense heat waves, droughts, etc., that are occurring more frequently. And we need to plan for feeding our 1.4 billion population. When we talk about sustainability in our food system, we also need to consider how to design a food system that ensures not only sufficient availability of food, feed and fiber for India's large population, but also good nutrition. And, how we are producing food that is environmentally sustainable and globally competitive. So overall, when we talk about a sustainable food systems transformation, we need to really think about five critical but interrelated aspects. The first one is consumption of healthy diets by all, by which what I mean is people have access to healthy and nutritious diets. This is much needed as India's population currently is facing the dual challenge of obesity and undernutrition. So, how we plan for that becomes critical. The second important issue is, having strong livelihoods throughout the food system to improve access to nutritious food so that rural communities have resources to sustain themselves, especially poor and vulnerable groups and women. This would require mitigating post harvest losses in the food supply chain and reducing waste in our homes, hotels, restaurants, catering, etc. The third critical aspect is protection of our open natural ecosystems, forests, and restoration of degraded land uh, to really have thriving landscapes. Because food and nutrition is sourced not only from agricultural land, but also from forests and our aquatic ecosystems. To give you an
Right.
example, non-timber forest produce provides 50% of the household income for one-third of India's rural population. Designing strategies for restoring ecosystems is critical for sustainable food systems. And IPCC has identified cost effective land management as one of the strategies that can contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation, combat desertification and land degradation, and overall enhance food security. The fourth and a very critical point is how are we doing environmentally sustainable food production? This is a must, and we have enough evidence of increasing water scarcity, for instance, with depleting groundwater tables and unsustainable agricultural practices, inequity in agriculture, water use, for instance, among crops. So, overall, when we are talking about sustainable food systems, we need to focus on designing resilient food systems that maintain food security and nutrition in the short and long run for a diverse population groups.
Right. And taking from your last point about environmentally sustainable food production, how can strategies like sustainable agriculture be integrated? And what are some of the challenges specifically that these practices face on the food production side of things?
Adoption of strategies like sustainable agriculture is a must to heal our soils, reduce environmental impact of how we grow our food. For decades, there has been a bias in public investment, which has led to misalignment, for instance, of cropping pattern vis-a-vis available resources for irrigation. For instance, wheat, rice, sugarcane are being grown in areas with low water availability. What the
Right.
policymakers in India need to do now is to plan for these interlinked but contradictory challenges. The focus of Indian agriculture, as I said earlier, since the Green Revolution has been on food security. However, with risks associated with climate change, the focus needs to shift to nutritional security, healthy food. This would require repurposing some of the perverse incentives on agriculture, incentivizing farmers to grow food more sustainably, strategies, for instance, that support crop diversification and better access to market that can improve income for people dependent on land. These are farmers, tenant farmers, women farmers, and farmers understand the challenges. However, they also need access to right incentives, connection with the market to thrive and sustain. So, when we think about strategies, it's about building awareness on good agricultural practices in the production system that incentivizes overutilization, for instance, of chemical fertilizers, incentivizes farmers to diversify crops, and improves market access. We need an integrated strategy which must consider trade offs that may arise from deploying different policy measures. To give you an example, solarization of pump sets, should not lead to depletion of groundwater, and there needs to be an emphasis on incentivizing farmers to not over irrigate. So, how do we think about when we are designing some of these strategies for sustainable agriculture in terms of the inputs that are provided, incentives that farmers have, best practices that farmers have access to? All of these need to be thought through together for really having transforming our agricultural systems.
Right. And if we were to move past now the production side of things, you mentioned an integrated approach and looking at market linkages as well. So, as we know, food loss often occurs during storage or transportation, and food is also wasted at the consumer end. What are the implications of this food loss and food waste, and how can these losses and waste be mitigated?
There are huge implications of food getting lost or wasted across the supply chain. If I just talk from a climate perspective, if global food loss and waste was a country, then it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. There are several drivers. I think coming to your question, essentially, when we're talking about food being lost or wasted, it's lost or wasted due to several reasons. Post harvest, farm gate, near farm, all wholesale retail going all the way to consumer level. And for instance, um, at the farm gate, there may be issues around inadequate storage infrastructure, or the kind of harvesting practices or sorting or grading practices that farmers may be deploying, which may be leading to reducing spoilage for food as they go further around the food supply chain. Market level, there are several issues in terms of, again, poor infrastructure, poor supply, demand forecasting and planning, price volatility, because of which sometimes food is, again, wasted, suboptimal packaging and storage. Consumption level, you, me, all of us as consumers, sometimes don't pay adequate attention to wastage. There's lack of awareness. Existing norms, attitudes are a challenge, and um, people don't consider the risks essentially associated with it. So when we are talking about drivers, it's really, there's a lot of structural issues that also need to be considered, right? So that we can really build that food supply chain. So which would require innovations, access to financing, the right policies and regulation, and sort of climatic conditions also play a role when we think about it.
Right. And yeah, food waste, especially at the consumer end, I think all of us can attest to the fact that I'm sure the scale of it is massive, but even at an individual level, it's something that we see quite unfortunately and commonly. You mentioned the equity aspect a little earlier in the conversation, especially when we were talking about the production side of things. How can sustainable food systems make a difference, particularly in building the social resilience, economic climate resilience for forests and farm-based communities? What would be the impact of sustainable food systems on these communities?
Having a sustainable food systems make a huge difference in building social, economic, and climate resilience of local communities, and enhancing their livelihoods. We need to unpack, what we say by local communities, right? Uh, as I said earlier, India is a diverse country, diverse groups, different caste, class, gender, and how, when we are thinking about, enhancing livelihoods, we need to think about some of these social dynamics as well, and who has access to land, for instance. I mentioned earlier, when we're thinking about sustainable agriculture, incentives that are designed, most of the time farmers may be getting it, right? But what about tenant farmers or women landholders, women who don't have land titles, as an example? So, with the combination, given that India is a rising population, there's rapid economic growth and environmental vulnerability. There are several challenges. We really need to think about, when we're thinking about enhancing livelihoods of vulnerable castes, women, landless, tenant farmers, all of them together. And the food systems, can play a role in enhancing livelihoods. As I said, we need to think about enhancing livelihoods throughout the food system, right? And overall, if I talk about the land sector, it has one third of the mitigation potential and can support in building and thriving a land-based restoration economy. But for this, what we need is really looking at, the dependence of people on land and forests. What is that vision for the sustainable food systems? Um, Designing strategies that reduce, for instance, distress migration of people from rural areas for jobs. This would require strengthening, for instance, on-farm and off-farm livelihoods. To give you an example, we I was talking about production systems earlier and food loss and waste. So post harvest, is there focus on processing of certain crops, commodities at the farm gate, or techniques or innovations that can improve shelf life of a perishable commodity through solar drying or cooling? Now, these are different kind of jobs that can be sort of propagated, right? So there is a huge potential when we think about, it's not just taking the produce to the market, but what we are doing in terms of processing to increase shelf life, which can help in sort of further enhancing. And a lot of these jobs could be for women, could be for youth, locally, could be for landless. If we can sort of support with the right capacity building, skills, trainings, that would be critical. And decision makers in India really need to start thinking systematically about, how food and land use systems can help us to protect our natural environment, provide that access to nutritious, affordable food, but strengthen resilience and enhance prosperity. So essentially, we really need to think about circular food systems and creating that enabling ecosystem that can support local businesses, farmer producer companies, local innovators across the food supply chain, who and having, enabling access to capital, capacities, and incentives, so that some of these examples that I provided of different restoration businesses, or businesses that help in reducing food loss or waste across the supply chain, they can be strengthened. And all of this will help overall in sort of supporting and enhancing livelihoods and jobs and spurring that larger land-based restoration economy.